dommage, frère, il te met une ninja ou une samouraï et puis frère, elle a une clope dans la gueule, frère, dégueulasse. Faux cop. Ça, si. Faut arrêter avec cette mode à la con, hein. Déjà, les cigarettes, c'est dépassé, heureusement, tant mieux. Oh my god, alors, attends, c'est où? Bah alors, argent, ah voilà. Money, 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 money. An economic history of the world season. Huh. C'est quoi ça?
It was the year of the American independence, and it was the year that the Scottish Enlightenment thinker Adam.
Ok, let's go. Je connais pas celle-là.
When I was working on my undergraduate degree at the University of Minnesota, my macroeconomics professor was Walter W. Heller. Professor Heller was sort of famous. He'd been President John F. Kennedy's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and after Kennedy's assassination, he continued in the same post for President Lyndon Baines Johnson until he had a disagreement with President Johnson over raising taxes to finance the Vietnam War. This was at a time when it looked like inflation would begin to overheat the economy. Had Johnson listened to Professor Heller, the inflation of the 1970s might have been avoided. You see, Heller was a Keynesian economist and very attuned to the role that the government could play in keeping the economy growing and on an even keel. Professor Heller was nearing the end of his career when I met him. He retired just a few years after I graduated. His course was rigorous, and he was a demanding teacher. He was also a very nice man. At least he was nice to a young undergraduate like me, who asked questions that, when I look back on them, were not very sophisticated. Professor Heller possessed a great command of the economic theories of John Maynard Keynes, which, in the heady days of the 1960s, were all the rage. Leaders and policymakers like Heller and JFK had little doubt that government intervention and Keynesian economics could correct the economic problems the country faced. Arguments between the Keynesians and the anti-Keynesians have persisted ever since and shaped much of the macroeconomic debate even today. But it was in an article that Professor Heller wrote when I was a student that had the greatest influence on me becoming an economic historian. In 1980, Heller published a short essay entitled, "Can There Be Another Crash?" In it, he looked back at the Great Depression. In reviewing the causes of the Depression and comparing it with the economic situation of the late 1970s, he concluded that it was unlikely that a crash would ever happen again. So he was mostly wrong. And as a historian, I now cringe when scholars attempt to predict the future based on an appeal to historical events. But at the time, I was struck by the fact that Professor Heller was taking a historical perspective on the study of economics, that he was interested in looking to the past to explain how we've gotten to where we are today. And that is something that historians are very much interested in exploring. So I gravitated to history in my studies, and particularly to economic history. After graduating, I went to work in business for several years. I worked for a printing company. This was at a time when desktop publishing was taking off, and the printing industry, especially quick printing, was booming. But the age of electronic media was waiting just around the corner. I was afraid that the printing business might not be the best career choice for me. So I returned to school, this time for my doctorate. Since I had always been interested in economic history, and people like Walter Heller had shown me what a fascinating topic it could be, I chose that as my field. Actually, my greatest interest was in the early modern period, roughly from 1500 to 1800. I studied foreign merchant communities and world trade before industrialization. Toward the end of that period in history, an individual who would have a profound effect on how we think about the economy today and about economic history wrote a very long and very influential treatise that presented the way he thought the economy worked. The treatise was published in 1776, a watershed year. It was the year of the American independence, and it was the year that the Scottish Enlightenment thinker Adam Smith came to the public's attention as the author of the seminal work, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Smith's book outlined what he thought were the principles of economic behavior. He described an invisible hand that guided human behavior for the common good. Underlying his book, however, is the recurring theme of self-interest. Smith wrote, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest." Smith was not the only early thinker to write about how the economy works, but he's certainly the best known. Most people today, including most economists, think that Smith was identifying some of the universal truths or overarching laws.
Ok, donc ça c'est fait. Euh, alors comme tu l'as peut-être constaté, je l'ai fait 2 fois aujourd'hui. D'habitude c'est pas le cas. D'habitude je le fais une fois, mais là ça fait, j'ai passé tellement de temps sur Quora que je n'avais pas suffisamment fait. Donc il me reste une session à rattraper demain. Donc demain j'en ferai deux sessions aussi. Et normalement je serai bon parce que j'ai réussi normalement à le faire bientôt, toute l'année entière, non-stop. Tous les jours, je suis parvenu à le faire et je veux garder ce rythme. Donc ça c'est cool. Euh, et puis et puis donc attends, on a combien de temps? Du coup ouais, je vais arrêter celle-là. Je vais continuer encore l'exercice. J'ai des pompes à faire, j'ai des haltères, j'ai des tractions. Et puis ouais, je te dis à tout de suite. À toutes.